Hi everyone, I'm Kitty from RariLabs, and RariLabs is a contributor to RareMo Protocol. And RareMo Protocol is a ZK identity protocol that allows you to not only make your identities private and verifiable, but also your social graph. So to give an idea of the kind of tech that this unlocks, the thing that we're best known for is our surveillance-free voting tool, Freedom Tool. And Freedom Tool was released about 6 months ago, and it was almost instantly picked up by opposition in Russia who used it to protest Putin and challenge his inauguration. And it was then picked up by dissidents in Iran who used it to protest the Islamic Republic in Iran. And then most recently, we had our first use case with elected officials in Georgia, where opposition MPs used it to host tamper-proof polling in the presidential elections. But in this talk, I'm going to go through these use cases and then also discuss how in the process of building these voting tools, where privacy can't just be an ideal, but really, really needs to be robust, we discovered a lot of issues with the pre-existing identity frameworks that exist in Web3 and serious privacy vulnerabilities. So I'm going to discuss how we then circumvented that and built a system called the ZK Identity Registry, which injects not only like true and robust privacy into identity in Web3, but also permissionlessness. So as I mentioned, Freedom Tool is this surveillance-free voting solution. And it solved a kind of long-term technical challenge in the digital democracy space, which is like, how do you allow people to prove that they are eligible to vote without also making them vulnerable to tracing? And we did this through the magic of ZKPs. So for like anyone who's new to ZKPs and zero knowledge, it's a type of cryptography that lets one party prove to another party certain things about themselves without revealing any additional data. So with voting, we allowed users to prove that they are over 18, that they're a unique human, and also that they're of like whatever citizenship they needed to be to participate in the vote. And it was super easy to use. The kind of central artifact is the passport. So like if you want to cast a vote with Freedom Tool, you just take your passport and you use your phone to like tap the NFC chip inside the passport, and Freedom Tool will verify like all of the data, and it will issue you with a ZKP that like gives you an anonymous voting pass, and then you can cast the vote, and the vote itself is registered on the blockchain where it's completely tamper-proof. And everything happens like client side on the phone. So nothing ever passes through a centralized server. There's no points where it can be hacked. It is like so easy to use. I really can't like emphasize enough how simple it is. Like your grandma could do it, and that was partly like how this tool became so successful. But on to the first use case. So as I mentioned, Freedom Tool was used in Russia, where it was picked up by an opposition activist called Mark Fagan. And Mark is the former Pussy Riot lawyer, and he is currently in exile. And he wanted to use this tool not just to facilitate protest, but also to create like a better feedback loop with dissidents in Russia. So like, as you can imagine, in these kind of environments, it's very, very hard for opposition leaders to have any certainty that they're actually representing the desires of the people that they're seeking to represent. Like, it's so hard to get a gauge on what they want. So the vision behind Russia 2024 was that like opposition leaders could host routine votes to get a sense of what the dissident population are feeling. And the first vote that was hosted on there was basically giving people an opportunity to protest Putin's inauguration. So it was, do you think that the election results were legitimate? And over 40,000 votes were cast, and the app was downloaded by 25,000 users just in the first 24 hours alone, which broke records in Web3. And obviously, like, this is quite a small percentage of like the entire Russian population. But the kind of beauty of it was that it provides, as I mentioned, this like feedback loop, but also it gave dissidents like a chance to express their dissent and the fact that they didn't believe that these votes were legitimate. And the biggest challenge, of course, with any tool like this, where the stakes for using it are so high, is creating trust with the public. So we hope that as these tools like continue and people can see that the users aren't being persecuted and aren't being traced and are surviving, that more and more will start to use them. And this app in particular was actually attacked by the Kremlin several times. So one of the kind of strangest or like most fascinating like forms of attack that they did was mobilize these like, it turns out the Kremlin have basically like a cabal of like state-sponsored app reviewers who just like religiously will tank all of the ratings so that it's like difficult to find and people can't get a hold of it. And they did that, but they also the kind of the people who were being paid to like submit these reviews were also sending messages being like, we really need this kind of anonymous voting, like please keep this app alive, don't remove it. So that was like a very powerful testament to like how critical these tools are, and the kind of outlet that it gave to people in Russia. And off the back of that, we had the next use case in Iran where, it was very similar. It was used for protest. And we then, only a couple of weeks ago, had our use case with elected officials. And that was with opposition leaders in Georgia. And they did something quite interesting with Freedom Tool, where they did this kind of tamper-proof polling, which is quite similar, like functionally, to the use cases in Russia and Iran, where it's like anonymous voting. But they also wanted to use it to combat low voter turnout. So they built this quite complex point system where users were rewarded for kind of anything that indicated political engagement. So you got rewards for polling, you got rewards for voting, you got rewards for reporting voter fraud, and all of this like irregardless of political alliance. And they then pledged that if elected, they would use the app to experiment firstly with liquid democracy, which is where you vote not just in presidential elections, but routinely on legislation. And this is possible with a tool like Freedom Tool because the costs of voting are so dramatically reduced. So I think it's like quite an interesting testament to how these tools like not only protect people from surveillance and allow voting to be digital, but allow people to experiment with slightly different models for democracy. And they also pledged that they would use the system to digitize a whole load of identity services in Georgia. So like notaries, registries, all these things, and then use the profit from that to distribute universal basic income. And the presidential elections have just taken place in Georgia. They're being contested. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that they were rigged. So at the moment, the incumbents are still in power, and it's not entirely clear what will happen and how much of this will go live. But it was used for the tamper-proof polling, and it was used for voter incentives. So that's the kind of overview of how the app like works. But what I want to talk about now is what's happening under the hood and how like in the process of building this, as I mentioned, we were able to create like a model for stronger and like more robust privacy in Web3. So one of the biggest challenges that we faced when we were building Freedom Tool, and that like most identity protocols will struggle with, is uniqueness. So like in the case of voting, it's quite intuitive like why you would want to be able to guarantee that users are unique, right? Like you don't want one people or like a bunch of people coming in and just like endlessly voting and corrupting the results. And you only need to look at stuff like airdrops and like bot farming to get a sense of like how critical uniqueness is for like any identity protocol. It's kind of like one of the core characteristics you need to prove. But it's extremely difficult to do it and also make it private. Like, you're trying to check that somebody is who they says they are and they're not these other people and they're not in the system more than once, and yet you can't like get access to anyone's personal data in the process. So what's happened so far in the space is that almost every other existing framework has found themselves forced to rely on third-party attesters, usually an NPC. So in this kind of model, say they were using we use passports for uniqueness, but say they were using fingerprints, you would scan your finger, and a nullifier of that fingerprint would be created and then would be like checked against all the other fingerprint nullifiers in the system to make sure you're not the same person, like, you know, voting again and again. And then every time you want to prove your uniqueness, you would send like a request to the third party and you would ask them to issue a proof of uniqueness. And this creates like huge, maybe not huge, it creates significant privacy risks because it means that if someone gets a hold of the attester or the MPC that's been used, they can see specifically what actions the user is participating in. And if you are like operating a very high risk use case, like voting in regimes, where even participation itself could be criminalized, like this was a risk that we felt was too high. And there were also a whole bunch of like other downsides that are associated with this kind of third-party attester model. So the first is that it's very vulnerable to regulatory interference. Like you can be fined, it can be shut down, there can be data requests. But I think like even more alarming is that it's not truly decentralized and it's not permissionless. So it kind of perpetuates this system that we're all trying to move away from, like in identity in Web3, of like users having to ask to issue their identity and having to rely on like somebody else to give it to them. And I think like we are in this very nascent and early stage of decentralized identity, and like these are the risks that are only visible now. But if we continue to build on infrastructure and frameworks that does have third-party attesters and it's not permissionless, it's like there will likely be all kinds of other issues that like stem from that develop down the line that aren't even like conceivable now. So it's like really important we go back to this like core framework and this core model and make sure it is permissionless and it is you know, truly private. And so that is what we did. And we built what we call RariLabs permissionless ZK identity registry. So this represents like an entirely new paradigm for issuing identity. It completely gets rid of third-party attesters, and instead it lets users issue their self-issue their identity. So it kind of ends this cycle of dependency. And the sort of like light bulb moment that made us realize a model like this was possible was when we recognized that like passports are already issued, so you don't need to like reissue them a second time. And what we did instead is created a system where when you scan in your passport, the nullifier of that passport is published on chain and anytime into the ZK identity registry itself. And anytime you like want to prove your uniqueness, you yourself can generate a proof of inclusion in this registry. Like you don't have to go and ask anyone, you can just straight away do it. And the beauty of this system is not just that it, you know, gives users agency and control over their identities, but it also provides much stronger privacy guarantees because you cannot figure out what activity the user is participating in. So even in like the worst case scenario, like if someone stole your passport or if like, I don't know, a tyrannical government got hold of your passport keys, the most that they would be able to verify is that you're published in the registry. They wouldn't be able to figure out what you're doing. So like you could be using it to cast votes, you could be using it to collect meme coins, whatever. And we kind of christened this the privacy as network effect, because the more users in the system and the more apps, the more impossible it becomes to make logical deductions about how users are behaving. So yeah, stronger privacy, self-issuance, and this kind of, you know, this model that I think like much more closely represents what we're actually seeking with Web3 infrastructure. And the real like beauty of this system as well is that it isn't just limited to passports. So the passport registry was simply like the first registry that we built, and there were all kinds of sub-registries that can sit inside it too. So one thing that like we're really focused on at the moment is what we call the reputation sub-registry. And this is where you're bringing the social graph, so history of your interactions, like your social networks, all of that into this model. And this is like pretty groundbreaking because traditionally in the identity space, like you've only ever been able to go anonymous for kind of like one-off solutions. You haven't been able to store like historical interactions and social relationships in a private but verifiable fashion. And this has seriously limited the use cases that you can build like and kind of have privacy with. So with this ZK reputation registry, we're seeing all sorts of social apps and experiments with social media happening on top of them. And just to name like a couple, we've got an experiment with a social media platform that kind of uses history of what you've engaged with and what you've liked to develop new types of algorithms and matching that's private. We've got prediction markets that are using reputation systems to give people scores for having like rich conversation underneath the markets that they're betting on. So the markets don't just become, financial tools, but also like homes to really rich dialogue. It's kind of like a Reddit meets a betting platform. So there's a lot more to come. This was just like a very basic overview, and if you're interested in building in Rarimo or finding more about the project, or if this just like inspired you in any way, got to do the slides, you can follow us on Twitter, and you can follow me, and you can DM me, and I'll also be just like floating around the venue for a little bit. So thank you so much for having me, and I hope that was interesting.